We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ties That Bind. Dominic Dom Tanner never considered himself extraordinary. At 42, his salt and pepper hair framed a face weathered by both laughter and hardship. What set him apart was his unwavering dedication to his 11-year-old son, Mason. Mason had been diagnosed with autism at age 3. While some might have seen limitations, Dom saw a brilliant mind that processed the world differently. Mason's encyclopedic knowledge of marine biology and his ability to recall the Latin name of virtually every sea creature had earned him the nickname Ocean Boy from his father. Their morning routine never varied. Dom would prepare Mason's breakfast, precisely 3 blueberry pancakes arranged in a triangle with maple syrup in a separate container for controlled dipping. Then came the 15-minute session with Mason's weighted blanket, a sensory tool that helped him transition into his day. The bull shark can live in both saltwater and freshwater, Mason announced one morning, flapping his hands excitedly. Its scientific name is Carcharodonus lucas. That's incredible, buddy, Dom replied, handing Mason his carefully packed lunch. The blue lunchbox contained compartmentalized sections, no foods touching, just as Mason needed. Dom's construction company, Tannerbuilt, had grown from a one-man operation into one of the most respected commercial builders in the Pacific Northwest. His success allowed him to create a specialized environment for Mason: sound-dampening walls, sensory spaces, and a spectacular saltwater aquarium that spanned an entire wall of their home. Dom's wife, Brooke Tanner, had once been his high school sweetheart and greatest ally in raising their son. The daughter of Wallace and Louise Harrington, prominent real estate developers with a portfolio stretching across 3 states, Brooke had defied her parents' expectations by marrying Dom, who they considered beneath their social standing. You could have had anyone, Wallace had told her at their wedding reception, champagne loosening his tongue. A doctor, a lawyer, not some contractor with dirt under his fingernails. For years, Brooke had defended their marriage and embraced Mason's autism, attending every therapy session and IEP meeting. But something had shifted over the past 18 months. Dom couldn't pinpoint exactly when, but Brooke's warmth had cooled. Her once frequent touches became rare. The light that had danced in her eyes when she looked at Mason dimmed, replaced by something that resembled resentment. "He's 11 now, Dom," she said one evening after Mason had gone to bed. "We need to start thinking about his future. My parents know about a residential facility in Vermont. It's supposed to be excellent." Dom stared at her, the architectural plans he'd been reviewing forgotten. "A facility? He's our son, not a problem to be managed." "That's not what I meant," Brooke backtracked, but the damage was done. The thought had been voiced, the unthinkable suggested. The Harringtons had never fully accepted Mason. Their awkward pats on his head during infrequent visits, and their visible relief when he retreated to his room, told Dom everything he needed to know about their true feelings. Dom increasingly found himself alone with Mason, while Brooke cited charity committee meetings and fundraising events that stretched late into evenings. Her parents encouraged these activities, always inviting her to high-profile social functions where Dom, the contractor with calloused hands, would have been an uncomfortable addition. What Dom didn't see were the text messages. What he didn't notice were the unexplained weekend spa retreats that left no trace of relaxation on Brooke's face. What he couldn't have known was that his marriage had already fractured, and he was simply living in the aftermath of a break that hadn't yet announced itself. Chapter 2. Fracture Lines. The invitation arrived on embossed stationery, the Harrington family crest stamped in gold at the top. The Harrington Annual Lake Retreat, it announced in flowing script. 2 weeks of family, relaxation, and celebration. Dom found Brooke packing her suitcase 3 days before the scheduled departure. Mason's clothes were conspicuously absent from her preparations. "Where's Mason's stuff?" Dom asked, leaning against the doorframe of their bedroom. Brooke's hands stilled over her meticulously folded cashmere sweater. "Dom, we need to talk about the retreat." The conversation that followed would later replay in Dom's mind hundreds of times, each recollection more painful than the last. Mason isn't invited this year, Brooke said, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on her luggage rather than her husband's face. What do you mean, not invited? He's our son. You know how he struggles with changes in routine. The lake house, the boat rides, the family dinners that run late. It's overwhelming for him. Dom stepped closer. We've always made accommodations. Your parents have that guest house where we can take him if things get too stimulating. He loves watching the boats from the dock. Brooke finally looked up. Her expression hardened with resolve. My parents were clear this time. They wanted a normal family vacation, without outbursts or special arrangements. The word normal hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. And you agreed to this? Dom asked, his voice dangerously quiet. It's just 2 weeks, Dom. You're great with him. Much better than I am, honestly. This isn't about who's better with him. This is about our son being excluded by his own grandparents, and his mother allowing it. Brooke's shoulders squared defensively. My father had a minor heart scare last month. He doesn't want any additional stress. Mason isn't stress. He's a child who deserves to be with his family. I've already agreed, Dom. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Her tone carried finality, as though the matter was closed for discussion. That night, Dom lay awake long after Brooke had fallen asleep. Something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, a fault line exposed that he couldn't ignore. The woman sleeping beside him was no longer the fierce advocate who had once told her father, Mason isn't disabled. The world just isn't enabled for him yet. Over the next 2 days, Dom observed Brooke with new awareness. He noticed how she flinched slightly when Mason repeated the same fact about manta rays for the 4th time. How she slipped out of the room during his evening meltdown over a change in the dinner menu. How her smiles never quite reached her eyes when she told Mason, Mommy's going on a trip, but I'll bring you back something special. The day of departure arrived. Dom drove Brooke to her parents' expansive colonial-style home, where they would all leave together for their private airstrip. Mason had been left with his longtime behavioral therapist, Vanessa, who would stay at the house while Dom worked. I'll call every night, Brooke promised, kissing Dom briefly on the lips before exiting the car. Dom watched as she ascended the steps to her parents' front door, her posture straightening with each step as though shedding a weight. Wallace opened the door before she could knock, enveloping his daughter in a hug that seemed to convey not just affection, but approval. As Dom began to pull away, something caught his eye. A sleek black Range Rover parked in the circular driveway, a vehicle he didn't recognize from previous family gatherings. The momentary curiosity faded as he headed to the construction site where his crew was breaking ground on a new project. 3 days passed. Brooke's nightly calls were brief, filled with vague descriptions of sunset cruises and gourmet meals. She rarely asked about Mason, and when she did, she changed the subject quickly after Dom's updates. On the 4th day, a subcontractor failed to deliver crucial materials to Dom's work site. After numerous unsuccessful calls, Dom decided to visit the supplier personally. The detour took him past the private airfield where the Harringtons kept their jet. What he saw there changed everything. The Harrington jet was on the tarmac, apparently delayed due to mechanical issues according to the ground crew Dom casually questioned. But it wasn't the jet that froze Dom's blood in his veins. It was the family waiting in the private lounge, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Wallace and Louise Harrington stood talking with Brooke. Beside them, a tall man with a swimmer's build had his arm around Brooke's waist in a gesture of casual intimacy that only comes from long familiarity. But what truly shattered Dom's world were the 2 children, a boy and a girl who appeared about 9 years old. The boy was spinning in circles, flapping his hands in a self-stimulating behavior intimately familiar to Dom. The girl was wearing noise-canceling headphones, her focus intent on lining up toy cars in a perfect row on the lounge floor. Children who, like Mason, clearly existed somewhere on the autism spectrum. Children who were apparently special enough to be included on the family vacation. Children who belonged to Brooke and the man now leaning down to kiss her. Not a friendly peck, but the lingering kiss of established lovers. Dom's phone rang with Mason's special ringtone, snapping him back to reality. He answered mechanically, hearing Mason's excited voice describing a new documentary about deep-sea creatures. He responded on autopilot, making appropriate noises of interest while his mind raced with implications. "Dad, are you listening? The colossal squid has the largest eyes of any animal on Earth." Dom forced himself to focus on his son's voice, the one pure thing remaining in his suddenly fractured world. "That's amazing, Ocean Boy. Tell me more." Chapter 3. The Revelation. Dom didn't confront Brooke when she returned from the family vacation 2 weeks later. He didn't mention what he had seen at the airfield. Instead, he watched and waited, gathering information like a man preparing for war. He hired Blake Reed, a private investigator recommended by his company's security consultant. Reed was a former military intelligence officer who now applied his skills to domestic cases. "I don't need photographs of them together," Dom explained during their initial meeting in an anonymous coffee shop 20 miles from his home. "I need everything: timeline, finances, property, communications, the complete picture." Reed nodded, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. "The deeper I dig, the more expensive this gets. You sure you want the full excavation?" "Cost isn't an issue," Dom replied. "Just be thorough and discreet." While Reed conducted his investigation, Dom maintained a facade of normalcy. He prepared Mason's meals, attended his therapy sessions, and managed his construction business with outward calm. If Brooke noticed her husband's more distant demeanor, she gave no indication. 3 weeks after hiring Reed, Dom received a text with an address and time. The location was a nondescript office building that housed a tax preparation service, a travel agency, and, according to the directory in the lobby, the innocuously named Reed Consulting. Reed's office was Spartan: a desk, 3 chairs, filing cabinets, and computer equipment. No photographs or personal items humanized the space. The man himself had the coiled stillness of someone accustomed to patient observation. "What you're about to hear won't be easy," Reed began, sliding a leather portfolio across the desk. "But I believe in giving my clients the unvarnished truth." The truth, as it turned out, was more devastating than even Dom's worst suspicions. Brooke's affair with Nolan Pierce had begun 7 years ago, not 18 months as Dom had estimated. Nolan was a pediatric neurologist specializing in developmental disorders, whom Brooke had met during one of Mason's early evaluations. Pierce was married at the time. Reed continued dispassionately. His wife, Catherine, died in a car accident 5 years ago. The twins you saw, Olivia and Owen, are his children from that marriage. Both were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder around age 3, similar to your son. Dom's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests of his chair. After his wife's death, the relationship with your wife intensified. They've been effectively living dual lives. Pierce purchased a home under an LLC 30 minutes from your residence 3 years ago. Your wife has a key and typically spends 3 to 4 nights there weekly, coinciding with her supposed charity events and committee meetings. Reed opened the portfolio and removed a timeline chart meticulously documenting Brooke's movements over the past month. The evidence was irrefutable. The Harringtons have been aware of the relationship for at least 4 years, based on electronic communications I was able to access. They've not only approved but facilitated meetings, creating cover stories, and lending their vacation properties for rendezvous. Dom's voice was eerily calm when he finally spoke. "Financial entanglements?" Reed nodded appreciatively at the question. "Significant. Your wife has been transferring funds to a separate account. Approximately $380,000 over the past 5 years, drawn from your joint accounts and her personal inheritance. She's also been making regular payments toward the mortgage on Pierce's property and contributing to private school tuition for his children." "My money has been supporting his children," Dom stated rather than asked. "Yes. Additionally, there's a joint investment portfolio established 2 years ago that's grown to just over $1.2 million. Dom absorbed this information with the same detached calculation he applied to complex structural engineering problems. "Have they discussed their future plans?" Reed hesitated for the first time. This is where it gets particularly concerning. Based on text exchanges and emails recovered from cloud backups, they've been planning a permanent arrangement. Your wife filed preliminary divorce papers 3 months ago, but hasn't yet had them served. He removed several printed emails from the portfolio. Their plan appears to hinge on gaining custody of your son. Pierce's professional credentials and your wife's family connections would be leveraged to argue that your work schedule makes you an unsuitable primary caregiver. There are indications they intend to suggest your home environment isn't optimally structured for your son's developmental needs, despite evidence to the contrary. Dom read the emails, which contained detailed strategies for separating him from Mason. The clinical language disguised a monstrous intent to take his son and integrate him into their new family unit, effectively erasing Dom from the equation. The Harringtons have already retained Sloan Davidson, Reed added. She's known for aggressive custody litigation, particularly in high-net-worth separations. Dom closed the portfolio with deliberate care. Is that everything? The essential points. Full documentation is on this encrypted drive. Reed handed over a small metal USB device. And Dom, there's one more thing you should know. Your wife established a trust 6 months ago with Pierce as the primary beneficiary in the event of her death. The trust would control her share of your marital assets and her inheritance. The implication was clear. Dom had been systematically excised from Brooke's future, a cancerous growth to be surgically removed from her life when the timing was opportune. Thank you for your thoroughness, Dom said, standing and extending his hand. You'll find the remainder of your fee has been transferred to the account you provided. As Dom drove home, the last pieces of his former life crumbled away. The woman he had loved, the mother of his child, had been betraying him for most of their son's life. The in-laws who had never fully accepted him had been actively participating in the deception. But what truly ignited the cold rage in Dom's chest was the planned theft of his son. Mason wasn't just the center of Dom's world. He was Dom's world. The thought of his son being raised by the architect of this betrayal and her neurologist lover made something fundamental shift in Dom's psychological makeup. He pulled over to the side of the road and made a phone call to Gregory Walsh, his company's attorney and a friend from college. Greg, I need to meet with you tomorrow morning. It's urgent and confidential. Sure thing, Dom. Is this about the Westlake contract? No, Dom replied, watching a hawk circle overhead, patient in its hunt. This is personal, very personal. Chapter 4, The Invisible Man. Dom moved like a ghost through his own life in the weeks following Reed's revelations. He became the perfect husband, attentive, communicative, even affectionate when the situation warranted. He inquired about Brooke's charity work with convincing interest, suggested she take time for herself whenever possible, and never questioned her increasingly frequent absences. You seem different lately, Brooke commented one evening as they prepared dinner. More relaxed. Dom smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes, just gaining perspective on what matters. What mattered, of course, was Mason. Dom redoubled his involvement in his son's life, attending every therapy session, documenting every interaction with specialists, and creating video logs of their home routines. On the advice of his attorney, he began building an archive demonstrating his capability as Mason's primary caregiver. Greg Walsh had reacted to Reed's findings with professional concern and personal outrage. This is unconscionable, Dom, but we need to be strategic about how we proceed. I want sole custody, Dom had stated unequivocally, and I want to protect my business and assets. Given what you've shown me, we've got solid grounds. The financial diversions alone constitute marital waste. But custody battles get ugly, even with overwhelming evidence on one side. Walsh had connected Dom with Teresa Mendoza, a family law specialist with a reputation for handling complex custody cases involving children with special needs. Your situation has several advantages from a legal standpoint, Mendoza explained during their initial consultation. You've been consistently involved in your son's care and education. Your home is specifically adapted to his needs, and the planned conspiracy to separate you from your child will not play well before any judge. What about Pierce's credentials? He's a specialist in the field. Mendoza's smile was sharp, which creates an ethical conflict. A doctor who has been carrying on an affair with the mother of a patient, even if your son isn't his direct patient, has compromised professional boundaries. The medical board would take a dim view of such behavior. Dom absorbed this information, filing it away for future use. And the Harringtons? Old money thinks it can buy anything, including favorable custody arrangements. But judges aren't impressed by wealth when a child's welfare is at stake. Document any instances where they've shown bias against your son's condition or failed to accommodate his needs. Armed with legal advice and Reed's continuing surveillance, Dom implemented the first phase of his response, becoming invisible while seeing everything. He installed monitoring software on the family computers and home network, tracking Brooks' digital footprint. He placed voice-activated recording devices in strategic locations throughout their home. He set up trail cameras on the property that sent real-time alerts to his phone whenever someone arrived or departed. Knowledge, Dom reasoned, was both shield and sword in the coming conflict. As autumn progressed, he gathered evidence of Brooks' deceptions. The emergency board meeting that coincided with dinner at Pierce's home. The shopping trip with Louise that was actually a consultation with Sloan Davidson. The migraine that kept her in bed all day while Dom took Mason to occupational therapy, only for her to slip out the moment they left for Pierce's twin school recital. Through it all, Dom maintained his performance as the oblivious husband. He expressed sympathy for Brooks' frequent headaches, offered to delay his work schedule to accommodate her supposed commitments, and never betrayed his awareness of her elaborate double life. The most difficult performance came when Brooks suggested they host Thanksgiving dinner. "My parents would love to see the house," she explained over breakfast. "And I thought we could invite some friends too." Dom understood immediately who some friends encompassed. "Sound great. Mason will enjoy having a celebration here in his comfort zone." Brooks' smile faltered slightly. "Well, I was actually thinking Mason might be more comfortable having dinner separately. You know how overwhelming large gatherings can be for him." "Who did you have in mind for guests?" Dom asked, carefully stirring his coffee. "Just my parents, my cousin Heather and her husband, and my friend Nolan. He's that neurologist I've mentioned. He has twins who are on the spectrum too. I thought it might be nice for Mason to meet other children who share some of his experiences." The audacity was breathtaking. Dom marveled at how easily the lies flowed from her, how convincingly she performed concern for Mason while plotting to remove him from his father's life. "That sounds perfect," Dom replied with manufactured enthusiasm. "I'd love to meet this specialist who's helped so many families like ours." Thanksgiving arrived. Golden turkey, crystal glasses, and autumnal decorations transforming their modern home into a Martha Stewart tableau. Mason helped arrange the name cards, a task that satisfied his need for order while involving him in the preparation. Dom had spent the previous evening with Mason, carefully preparing him for the event. "There will be new people tomorrow, Ocean Boy. If it gets too loud or busy, you can use our signal, and we'll take a break in your quiet room, okay?" Mason nodded seriously. "Will Mom's doctor friend and his children understand about breaks?" "We'll make sure they do," Dom promised, the irony of preparing his son to meet his mother's lover not lost on him. Wallace and Louise Harrington arrived first, bearing expensive wines and forced smiles. Louise bent to kiss Mason's cheek, wiping her mouth discreetly afterward as though his condition might be contagious. "The house looks lovely," she commented, her gaze sweeping critically over the decor that Brooke had obsessively arranged. "Though I still think that beach property we showed you would have been more suitable." Dom knew the property she referenced, a secluded estate that had been suggested as an ideal environment for Mason, but was actually positioned to isolate them from neighbors who might notice Brooks' frequent absences. "Mason thrives on routine and familiar surroundings," Dom responded pleasantly. Uprooting him would have set his progress back significantly. Wallace harumphed, already pouring himself a scotch from Dom's liquor cabinet. Sometimes progress requires difficult adjustments. The subtle emphasis on difficult adjustments sent a chill down Dom's spine. Before he could respond, the doorbell rang again. Nolan Pierce was tall, conventionally handsome, and carried himself with the assured confidence of someone used to being deferred to. His children, Olivia and Owen, stood quietly beside him, displaying the controlled behavior of children who had been extensively coached. Dom, this is Dr. Pierce. Brooke introduced them with barely concealed nervous energy. Nolan, my husband Dom. Their handshake was a silent assessment, two predators measuring each other. I've heard so much about your work with children on the spectrum, Dom said, his grip deliberately firm. All part of the calling, Pierce replied smoothly. And this must be Mason. Hello, young man. Mason looked up briefly, then returned to arranging and rearranging the silverware at his place setting. Hello. Did you know octopuses have 3 hearts and blue blood? Pierce smiled indulgently. I didn't know that. Very good, Mason. These are my children, Olivia and Owen. The twins nodded politely, but maintained their distance. Dom noticed how their father's hand rested possessively on their shoulders, the slight pressure he applied when Owen began to rock slightly in place. Throughout dinner, Dom observed the dynamics with clinical detachment. The comfortable familiarity between Brooke and Pierce, disguised as professional respect. The knowing glances between Wallace and Pierce during discussions of education options for children with special requirements. The way Louise referred to the twins as such special little angels, while having never used similar endearments for Mason. Most revealing was the choreographed dance of questions directed at Dom about his demanding work schedule, the challenges of raising a child with autism, and the tremendous sacrifices required. It must be so difficult balancing a construction company with Mason's needs, Pierce commented, cutting his turkey into precise portions. My practice gives me more flexibility to accommodate the twins' requirements. Actually, I've structured my business specifically to prioritize Mason, Dom replied evenly. My project managers handle the day-to-day operations, allowing me to be present for therapy appointments, school events, and home routines. Brooke quickly redirected the conversation. Nolan has been developing some fascinating new approaches to sensory integration therapy. He's even been invited to present at an international conference next spring. In Switzerland, Louise added with poorly disguised excitement. Brooke mentioned she might accompany him as his research assistant. Such an opportunity. Dom took a sip of wine, noting how Brooke paled slightly. That's the first I'm hearing of this. How long would this conference be, honey? It's just in the discussion phase, Brooke stammered. Nothing definite. Pierce stepped in smoothly. The invitation only arrived last week. I mentioned it to Brooke when we ran into each other at that fundraiser for autism research. Her insights on parental experiences would add valuable perspective to the presentation. The practiced lie, the established alibi, the collaborative deception, all unfolded before Dom like a play he'd rehearsed but never performed. He wondered how many times this scene had been enacted in different variations throughout the years of their marriage. When Mason began showing signs of sensory overload, rapid blinking, increasingly repetitive movements, Dom immediately recognized the impending meltdown. Time for a break, Ocean Boy, he asked quietly. Mason nodded vigorously. Dom stood, planting his napkin beside his plate. Please excuse us for a few minutes. Mason needs some quiet time. I can help, Pierce offered, half rising from his seat. In my experience. Thank you, but we have an established protocol. Dom cut him off firmly. Mason responds best to consistency. In Mason's sensory room, Dom helped his son settle beneath the weighted blanket and activated the gentle underwater projection lighting that transformed the ceiling into an oceanic scene. Deep breaths like we practiced. Imagine you're a whale diving deep into calm waters. Mason's breathing gradually steadied as he focused on the simulated marine environment. Dad, do Dr. Pierce's children get overwhelmed at dinners too? Everyone gets overwhelmed sometimes, Dom answered carefully. But everyone has different ways of handling it. He made Owen stop rocking. Mason observed with unexpected perception. My therapist says stimming helps regulate emotions. Dom felt a surge of protective fury. Your therapist is right. Self-regulating behaviors are important tools. When they returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to the Harringtons' recent real estate acquisitions. Dom noticed how Brooke sat slightly closer to Pierce than before, their hands occasionally brushing during dessert service. As the evening concluded, Dom maintained his role as the gracious host, thanking everyone for coming and expressing particular appreciation to Pierce for his professional insights. After the guests departed and Mason went to bed, Brooke lingered in the kitchen, nervously rearranging already clean dishes. That went well, don't you think? Nolan has so much experience with autism. He could be a real resource for us with Mason. Dom regarded his wife thoughtfully, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time in years. The woman before him was a stranger wearing familiar skin, speaking rehearsed lines in a play nearing its final act. It's interesting how similar his twins are to Mason in some ways, Dom remarked casually. Almost like they could be related. Brooke froze momentarily before forcing a laugh. That's just how the spectrum presents sometimes. Similar behaviors across different children. Dom nodded as though accepting this explanation. You know what Mason said to me during our break? He noticed how Pierce stopped his son from rocking, from self-stimulating. He compared that to what his therapist teaches about allowing natural regulation behaviors. I'm sure Nolan knows what he's doing, Brooke defended quickly. He's an expert in the field. Expertise doesn't always translate to compassion, Dom observed, turning away to hide the contempt that threatened to break through his calm facade. I'm heading to bed. Don't stay up too late. That night, as Brooke slept beside him, Dom made his decision. He would not confront. He would not accuse. He would not engage in messy emotional scenes that would only traumatize Mason and allow Brooke and her conspirators to prepare counter-narratives. Instead, he would disappear, physically present, but emotionally and strategically ghost-like, observing, documenting, and preparing for the moment when his accumulated knowledge could be deployed with maximum effect. Let them believe their plans were proceeding undetected. Let them grow confident in their deceptions. Let them underestimate the father whose love for his son had transformed into something coldly implacable. The game board was set. The players had revealed their strategies. Now Dom would bide his time, invisible yet seeing everything, silent yet hearing all, as he orchestrated the systematic dismantling of those who sought to destroy what he held most precious. Chapter 5. Gathering Storms. Christmas approached with manufactured cheer. Brooke decorated the house with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, arranging for professional photographs of the three of them in coordinated holiday outfits. Dom recognized these efforts for what they were: evidence being created for future custody proceedings, visual testimony of a happy family unit with an involved mother. He played along, smiling for the camera while mentally cataloging each fabricated moment. Behind his cooperative exterior, Dom was assembling the components for his counter-strategy. His first priority was securing Mason's future. Working with Teresa Mendoza, he established a protection plan that would insulate his son from the coming conflagration. The trust needs to be ironclad, Dom insisted during a meeting in Mendoza's office. I want Mason's care, education, and therapy requirements guaranteed regardless of what happens with the divorce. We can structure it as a special needs trust, Mendoza explained, making notes in her legal pad, with you as trustee and a professional co-trustee as backup. The assets will be protected from creditors, divorce settlements, and cannot be diverted to any purpose other than Mason's benefit. Dom transferred significant personal assets into this arrangement, careful to use only funds that were indisputably separate property: inheritances, premarital investments, and business holdings established before his marriage. The movements were executed through a series of legitimate transactions that would withstand any future scrutiny. Simultaneously, he began restructuring Tannerbilt. His company attorney, Greg Walsh, introduced him to Lucia Reyes, a corporate restructuring specialist. Your current setup leaves you vulnerable, Reyes observed, reviewing the company's organizational charts. Your wife could potentially claim significant ownership interest based on marital property laws, even though she's had no involvement in operations. How do we address that? We create a holding company structure that segregates the core business assets from the operational entities. It's legitimate asset protection that many businesses implement for liability purposes. Over the following weeks, Tannerbilt underwent a corporate metamorphosis, emerging as a network of LLCs and operating companies under the umbrella of a newly formed holding company. The reconfiguration, documented meticulously as a standard liability protection measure, effectively insulated the business's most valuable assets while maintaining operational continuity. What about the Harringtons? Dom asked during a strategy session with his legal team. They've made it clear they're backing Brooke and Pierce. Greg Walsh leaned forward. That's where things get interesting. I've had researchers looking into their real estate empire, and there are inconsistencies worth exploring. What kind of inconsistencies? Let's just say some of their development projects have involved regulatory shortcuts that wouldn't withstand close examination. Nothing criminal necessarily, but definitely in the gray area of compliance. Dom considered this information thoughtfully. I don't want to blackmail them. That's not the play here. Not blackmail, Walsh clarified. Leverage. Information that creates a mutual interest in discrete resolution rather than prolonged public litigation. As January's chill settled over the city, Dom implemented the next phase of his preparation, securing allies. He reached out to key figures in Mason's support network, his developmental pediatrician, occupational therapist, behavioral specialist, and teachers, arranging private meetings to discuss his son's progress. During these conversations, he never mentioned the impending divorce or Brooke's infidelity. Instead, he focused on Mason's needs and his own efforts to create stability. The unspoken message was clear. Dom was the consistent, engaged parent in Mason's life. Dr. Eleanor Winters, Mason's developmental pediatrician for the past 7 years, was particularly direct during their meeting. To be frank, Mr. Tanner, I've had concerns about your wife's engagement with Mason's treatment plan for some time, she admitted after Dom inquired about recent therapy adjustments. Her attendance at consultations has become sporadic, and she often seems distracted when she does attend. She's had a lot on her plate with her charity work, Dom offered neutrally. Dr. Winters' expression conveyed professional skepticism. Of course. However, in my experience, when one parent becomes significantly more involved than the other in managing a child's developmental needs, it often creates imbalances that affect the child's progress. Has Mason mentioned anything about these imbalances? Children are remarkably perceptive, especially those on the spectrum who often detect emotional undercurrents that neurotypical people miss. Mason has mentioned several times that Mom has important things to do when explaining her absences from activities he finds significant. Dom nodded, absorbing this information without visible reaction. I appreciate your candor, Dr. Winters. My priority is ensuring Mason's environment remains as supportive and consistent as possible. If circumstances change in your household, Dr. Winters added carefully, please know that I'm available to discuss adaptations to Mason's care plan. The message was received. Dr. Winters had observed enough to form conclusions about the family dynamic and was positioning herself as an ally in Mason's best interest. Similar patterns emerged in conversations with Mason's other care providers. His occupational therapist mentioned Brooke's increasing tendency to drop Mason off for sessions rather than participating as previously agreed. His special education coordinator noted that Brooke had missed the last 3 IEP meetings, sending signed documents without discussion. None of these professionals explicitly criticized Brooke, but their observations created a consistent narrative of a mother gradually disengaging from her special needs child's care, while the father remained steadfastly involved. As February arrived, Dom sensed Brooke and her collaborators accelerating their timeline. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Increased financial transfers to her hidden accounts, more frequent work dinners that extended into overnight absences, and heightened interest from the Harringtons in Mason's school performance and medical appointments. The catalyst came on a Tuesday evening when Dom returned from work earlier than expected. He found Brooke in their home office, hurriedly closing browser windows as he entered. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you, he apologized, noting the guilty flush on her cheeks. Just researching summer programs for Mason, she explained, shutting the laptop completely. There's a specialized camp in Vermont that might be good for him. Dom pretended to accept this explanation, but later that night, After Brooke had fallen asleep, he accessed the browser history she thought she had cleared. The searches weren't for summer camps, but for apartments in the same school district as Pierce's twins' private academy. The following day, Dom received an alert from the financial monitoring system he had established. Brooke had withdrawn $50,000 from their joint investment account. Not an enormous sum relative to their overall assets, but a significant escalation from her previous pattern of smaller, less noticeable transfers. That evening, he overheard a phone conversation between Brooke and her mother, captured by one of the recording devices in the house. "The papers are ready," Brooke was saying in hushed tones from the guest bathroom. "Sloan says we should file next week before he has any indication it's coming." "What about Mason?" Louise asked, her voice tinny through the phone speaker. "The preliminary evaluation from Dr. Keller supports our position that stability would best be served by primary placement with me, with transition to a more structured environment later if necessary." Dom didn't recognize the name Dr. Keller, but the implication was clear. They had arranged for an independent evaluation to support their custody strategy without his knowledge. "And the judge?" Louise pressed. "Sloan says Judge Watkins tends to favor maternal custody, especially with special needs children. Dad's talk with him at the foundation gala apparently went well." The casual reference to attempting to influence a judge through social connections crystallized Dom's next steps. He contacted Blake Reed that night. "I need surveillance on Judge Harold Watkins," Dom instructed. "Any connections to the Harringtons, social or financial. And find out everything you can about a Dr. Keller who's apparently conducted an evaluation of my son without my consent or knowledge." Reed's findings arrived within days. Judge Watkins had received substantial donations to his judicial campaign from shell companies linked to Harrington Developments. More troublingly, his wife served on the board of a charitable foundation where Louise Harrington was the chairperson. Dr. Martin Keller, meanwhile, was a child psychologist who operated a residential treatment center for children with developmental disorders, the same Vermont facility that Brooke had obliquely referenced as a summer camp. Financial records revealed the center had received over $2 million in donations from the Harrington Family Foundation over the past 3 years. The web of connections confirmed Dom's suspicions. The plan wasn't just to separate him from Mason through divorce, but to eventually place his son in an institutional setting, while Brooke created her new family unit with Pierce and his twins. The evidence was being manufactured, the authorities influenced, the groundwork laid for what would appear to outsiders as a reasonable custody arrangement. The final piece fell into place when Reed discovered that Brooke had booked one-way tickets to Switzerland, not for a conference, but departing the day after the divorce papers were scheduled to be filed. The reservation included seats for Brooke, Pierce, his twins, and Mason. They're planning to establish residence outside U.S. jurisdiction before the custody battle even begins, Greg Walsh concluded when Dom shared this information. Once they're established overseas with Mason, international custody disputes become nightmarishly complex. Can we get an emergency order preventing Mason from leaving the country? Dom asked, his composure finally cracking. Possibly, but it's risky, Walsh cautioned. Moving too soon alerts them that you're aware of their plans. They could accelerate or modify their strategy in ways we haven't anticipated. Dom stared out the office window at the gray February sky, weighing options and contingencies. How quickly can we move on the Harrington revelations? The regulatory compliance issues? I prepared the documentation. It could be submitted to the appropriate authorities within hours. And the judicial ethics complaint regarding Watkins? Ready to file. But Dom, once we pull these triggers, there's no going back. The confrontation becomes public and messy. Dom turned back to his attorney, his decision made. Then we need to change the battlefield. They're expecting a defensive action after they file. What they aren't expecting is for me to disappear before their first move. Disappear? Walsh echoed with concern. Not literally, Dom clarified. But I need to create circumstances where they believe their plan is proceeding while I'm actually controlling the sequence of events. I need them to think they've won before they realize the game has changed. The strategy took shape over intensive planning sessions with his legal team. Rather than waiting for Brooke's attack, Dom would execute a precisely timed series of maneuvers that would disrupt their carefully orchestrated plan while protecting Mason from the fallout. First, he documented every aspect of their home environment and Mason's care routine through video recordings, creating an unimpeachable record of his son's stability and his own competence as a caregiver. Next, he secured affidavits from Mason's treatment team regarding his progress and the consistency of Dom's involvement versus Brooks' increasing absences. Finally, he prepared a comprehensive divorce filing of his own, complete with evidence of Brooks' infidelity, financial diversions, and conspiracy to separate him from his son. The filing was ready, but would only be submitted if specific trigger conditions occurred. As winter reluctantly yielded to early spring, the atmosphere in the Tanner household grew increasingly strained. Brooks' absences lengthened, her excuses became more elaborate, and her interactions with Mason took on a performative quality, affectionate gestures that happened to occur when Dom was present to witness them. Mason, with his heightened sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, began showing signs of anxiety, increased repetitive behaviors, sleep disturbances, and more frequent meltdowns. During one particularly difficult evening, after Brooke had left for another charity function, Mason curled against Dom's side on the couch during their nightly reading session. "Dad, is Mom going to live with Dr. Pierce?" he asked unexpectedly, his fingers tracing repetitive patterns on the fabric of Dom's shirt. The question landed like a physical blow. Dom carefully kept his voice even as he asked, "What makes you ask that, Ocean Boy?" "I heard her talking to Grandma Louise. She said the new house has a special room ready for Mason, and Nolan's children are excited about being a family." Dom took a deep breath, maintaining outward calm while rage churned beneath the surface. Sometimes grown-ups talk about possibilities that might not happen. "Did this conversation worry you?" Mason nodded, his movements becoming more agitated. "I don't want a different house. I don't want different brothers and sisters. I want my room and my aquarium and you." "Listen to me very carefully," Dom said, gently turning Mason to face him. "No matter what happens, you and I are a team. That won't change. Your home is here. Your room is here. Your aquarium is here. I promise you that." "Mom said promises sometimes have to change when circumstances change," Mason replied, repeating what was clearly a direct quote. In that moment, Dom's remaining doubts evaporated. The time for patient observation had ended. The gathering storm was about to break, and he would control where and how it made landfall. That night, after Mason was asleep, Dom made a series of calls activating the contingency plan he had developed with his legal team. The machinery of his counter-strategy hummed to life, setting in motion events that would irrevocably alter the battlefield his adversaries thought they understood. As dawn broke, Dom stood at the window of his home office, watching the first tentative rays of sunlight illuminate the carefully maintained property. In the peaceful moment before the household stirred to life, he allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of grief for the marriage he had believed in and the family that had never truly existed as he had perceived it. Then he locked that grief away, replacing it with the cold clarity of purpose that had sustained him through months of clandestine preparation. Today, the invisible man would begin to materialize, not as the victim Brooke and her conspirators anticipated, but as an adversary they had fatally underestimated. Chapter 6. First Move. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a process server who caught Dom in the driveway as he prepared to take Mason to school. The timing was clearly deliberate, an attempt to create a scene that might unsettle Mason or provoke Dom into an emotional reaction that could later be characterized as instability. Dom disappointed them on both counts. He accepted the documents calmly, tucked them into his briefcase, and continued helping Mason into the car, maintaining their usual morning routine without interruption. "What was that man giving you, Dad?" Mason asked as they drove toward his specialized education center. "Just some more papers," Dom replied easily. "Nothing important that can't wait until after we talk about your ocean presentation. Have you decided which sea creatures you're going to include?" Mason launched enthusiastically into a detailed explanation of his planned presentation on deep-sea adaptations, the potential disruption averted through Dom's steady response. After dropping Mason at school, Dom drove, not to his office, but to a conference room at Teresa Mendoza's law firm, where his legal team awaited. He placed Brooke's divorce filing on the table alongside the considerably thicker portfolio he had prepared. Right on schedule, he noted, checking his watch. What's our timeline looking like? Greg Walsh consulted his tablet. Judge Watkins is conveniently available for an emergency hearing this afternoon regarding temporary custody. Our sources indicate Brooke's attorney plans to request that Mason be placed primarily with her pending the final divorce settlement, citing your work obligations and the specialized care environment that Pierce can provide. Dom nodded, unsurprised. And our countermeasures? Teresa Mendoza slid a document across the table. Judge Patricia Alvarez has reviewed our evidence of potential judicial misconduct and conflict of interest. She's issued this order reassigning all family court matters involving the Harrington family connections to her court, effective immediately. On what grounds? Administrative necessity and case management efficiency, Mendoza explained with a slight smile. Entirely routine judicial administrative matters that happen to completely derail their carefully constructed influence network. Walsh continued the briefing. The regulatory investigations into the Harrington development projects have been initiated. No public actions yet, but the internal reviews have already frozen approvals on 3 major projects, including the downtown high-rise that's the centerpiece of their current portfolio. What about Mason's protection? Dom asked, focusing on his primary concern. The temporary guardianship papers are prepared, Mendoza assured him. At your signal, we'll file for emergency appointment of Vanessa Reyes as Mason's temporary co-guardian alongside you. As his long-term behavioral therapist, she has established credentials regarding his care needs, and her affidavit strongly supports maintaining his current living environment and routines. Dom reviewed the document's attention to detail, then checked his watch again. Brooke will be expecting me to call her in panic once I've been served. When I don't, she'll escalate. Probably try to ambush me at the office or create some emergency situation involving Mason. We've coordinated with Mason's school, Walsh confirmed. They've been instructed that only you are authorized to pick him up today, and security has been notified of potential custody issues. We've also arranged for our investigator to maintain surveillance on Brooke's movements. Dom stood, straightening his jacket. Then it's time for me to be visible. I'll be at my office, conducting business as usual. Let them make the next move thinking I'm unaware of what's coming. As predicted, Brooke called Dom's cell phone repeatedly throughout the morning. He let the calls go to voicemail, listening to her increasingly agitated messages between meetings. Dom, we need to talk about what happened this morning. Dom, please call me back. This doesn't have to be difficult. Dom, my attorney says it's in everyone's best interest if we discuss temporary arrangements for Mason. At noon, he received a text from Blake Reed. Subject B meeting with Subject P at downtown location. Subject W observed entering same location 10 minutes later. Brooke, Pierce, and Wallace Harrington were having an emergency strategy session, undoubtedly recalibrating due to Dom's unexpected non-reaction to being served. At 2:30 p.m., Dom's assistant interrupted a project meeting. Mr. Tanner, your wife is here. She says it's urgent regarding Mason. Dom excused himself and went to the reception area, where Brooke waited with a facade of distress that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had dressed carefully in a conservative outfit that projected responsible motherhood, her hair and makeup impeccable yet understated. Dom, I've been trying to reach you all day, she began, her voice calibrated to carry just enough to be overheard by the receptionist without seeming intentionally theatrical. Is there somewhere we can talk privately about Mason? Dom led her to a small conference room, closing the door with deliberate calm. What's this about Mason? Is he all right? He's fine, but we need to discuss arrangements going forward, Brooke said, dropping the pretense of urgent concern now that they were alone. My attorney has filed for an emergency hearing on temporary custody this afternoon. I hope we could reach an agreement beforehand. What kind of agreement? Dom asked, taking a seat and maintaining an expression of mild confusion. Brooke placed a document on the table between them. This parenting plan gives me primary physical custody, with you having visitation on alternate weekends and one evening per week. I've been advised that it's a generous arrangement given the circumstances. What circumstances would those be? Dom inquired with genuine curiosity about how she would characterize her betrayal. Your work schedule is demanding, Dom. Mason needs consistency and specialized care. I've arranged for him to see Dr. Pierce for a comprehensive evaluation, and we found a school with an excellent program for children on the spectrum. Dom reviewed the document without comment, noting the provisions that would effectively marginalize his role in Mason's life while establishing a foundation for eventually transitioning him to the Vermont facility. This seems comprehensive, he finally said, looking up to meet Brooks' gaze directly. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this plan. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Brooks' expression at his unexpectedly reasonable tone. It's what's best for Mason. He needs stability during this transition. Stability, Dom repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting choice of word, considering you're proposing to remove him from the home he's known his entire life, separate him from his established care providers, and insert him into a newly formed household with a man he barely knows and children he's met once. Brooks' posture stiffened. Nolan is a specialist in developmental disorders. His experience with his own children gives him unique insight into Mason's needs. Yes, Nolan Pierce, Dom said conversationally. Pediatric neurologist, widower, father of twins on the autism spectrum, and your lover for the past 7 years. That Nolan Pierce. The color drained from Brooks' face. What are you talking about? Please, Brooke, let's not waste time with denials. I know about the affair. I know about the house he purchased where you spend 3 or 4 nights each week. I know about the financial transfers, the trust you established with him as beneficiary, and the Swiss arrangements you've made for after the divorce. You've been spying on me, she demanded, indignation replacing shock. That's illegal. My attorney will. Your attorney has more pressing concerns at the moment. Dom interrupted mildly. Judge Watkins has been removed from our case due to his undisclosed connections with your family. The emergency hearing you scheduled has been canceled pending reassignment to Judge Alvarez's court. Brooks' expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, alarm, and calculation. This doesn't change anything, Dom. The courts always favor maternal custody, especially with special needs children. Under normal circumstances, perhaps. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they? Not when the mother in question has been systematically preparing to alienate the child from his father, diverting marital assets to support her paramour's household, and conspiring with her parents to influence judicial proceedings. Dom slid a thumb drive across the table. This contains a small sample of the evidence I've accumulated. Voice recordings of your conversations with your parents discussing your plans for Mason. Financial records tracking the money you've transferred to accounts linked to Pierce. Travel itineraries for one-way flights to Switzerland scheduled for next week. You wouldn't use this, Brooke challenged, though her voice lacked conviction. A public custody battle would be traumatic for Mason, which is precisely why I prepared an alternative proposal. Dom removed a second document from his briefcase. My terms are straightforward. I retain full physical and legal custody of Mason. You receive the standard visitation schedule if you choose to remain in the country. The marital estate is divided equally, excluding my business interests and the assets you've already diverted. In exchange, none of this becomes public. Brooks stared at him in disbelief. You can't possibly think I'd agree to this. Actually, I expect your initial rejection, Dom acknowledged. But when you discuss it with your father, he'll recognize it as the only viable option that preserves the Harrington reputation and business interests. What are you talking about? At this moment, regulatory investigators are reviewing the permitting processes for the Harrington Market Street development, the Riverside project, and the Harbor Point complex. The preliminary findings suggest systematic code violations, improperly expedited approvals, and potential ethics breaches by certain officials who received substantial campaign donations from Harrington-affiliated entities. Dom spoke these devastating revelations in the same mild tone he might use to discuss weather forecasts. Nothing criminal, necessarily, just business practices that wouldn't withstand public scrutiny or extended regulatory investigation. Brooke's composure finally cracked. You're bluffing. You wouldn't destroy Mason's grandparents. I'm simply ensuring that Mason's best interests are protected, Dom corrected. The investigations proceed or halt depending entirely on how we resolve our current situation. This is blackmail. No, Brooke, this is consequences. For 7 years, you've maintained a double life. For 7 years, you've diverted family resources to support another household. For 7 years, you've planned to separate me from my son. Did you really believe there would be no reckoning? Dom stood, gathering his briefcase. You have until tomorrow morning to discuss my proposal with your parents and peers. After that, I file my own divorce petition with all supporting evidence, and the regulatory investigations proceed regardless of your decision. Dom, wait, Brooke called as he reached the door. What about Mason? Have you even considered what this will do to him? Dom turned back, allowing genuine emotion to surface for the first time. Mason is the only person I've considered throughout this entire process. Unlike you, I haven't been planning to ship him off to a residential facility in Vermont once he becomes inconvenient to my new life. Brooke's shock confirmed that Dom had uncovered even the aspects of their plan they believed most carefully concealed. Yes, I know about the Vermont Center and Dr. Keller's prearranged evaluation. I know everything, Brooke. Every plan, conversation, betrayal. There is nothing you can say or do that will surprise me now. He left her sitting stunned in the conference room, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. As he walked through his office, Dom maintained the composed demeanor his staff expected, giving no indication that he had just delivered an ultimatum that would determine his family's future. That evening, after picking up Mason from school and maintaining their regular dinner and homework routine, Dom received a series of increasingly frantic messages from Wallace Harrington, culminating in a demand to meet at the Harrington home immediately. Not possible, Dom replied via text. Mason's bedtime routine takes priority. The response was immediate. This is about Mason's future. Yes, it is, Dom answered. And any disruption to his established routines would be contrary to his best interests, something I'll be happy to explain to Judge Alvarez if necessary. By systematically referencing the judge who had replaced Watkins in their case and declining to engage on their preferred timeline, Dom maintained control of the interaction while signaling his unwavering position. After settling Mason for the night, Dom sat in his home office reviewing security camera feeds. As expected, Brooke did not return home. Instead, surveillance showed her arriving at Pierce's house, where Wallace and Louise Harrington's car was already parked in the driveway. His phone rang at 11:42 p.m. The caller ID showed Greg Walsh. They've reached out, Walsh reported without preamble. Sloan Davidson contacted me, proposing a private mediation tomorrow morning to resolve all outstanding issues amicably. Their translation from panic to formal legal channels was quicker than I expected, Dom observed. Did she indicate any specific terms? Nothing concrete, but she hinted that her clients are open to significant compromise regarding custody arrangements. She also mentioned that certain administrative reviews might be causing undue hardship to uninvolved parties, meaning the regulatory investigations are already causing problems for Harrington projects, Dom translated. Set the meeting for 10 a.m. at your office. Stress that I expect all parties to be present. Brooke, Pierce, and both Harringtons. You want Pierce there? That's unusual in initial divorce mediation. This isn't a standard mediation. This is a reckoning. They all played their parts in this conspiracy. They all need to understand the consequences. After ending the call, Dom sent a brief email to Mason's school, arranging for his behavioral therapist to provide additional support the following day. Then he reviewed the final components of his strategy, ensuring each contingency was addressed. Tomorrow would determine whether resolution came through negotiated settlement or scorched earth litigation. Either way, Dom would protect what mattered most, his son's well-being and his place in Mason's life. The elaborate deception orchestrated by Brooke and her accomplices had failed, undone by the quiet determination of a father they had fatally underestimated. As midnight approached, Dom finally allowed himself to acknowledge the deep sadness beneath his strategic calculations. Not for the marriage lost, that had been a fiction for years, but for the innocent boy sleeping down the hall who would inevitably be affected by the adult's machinations, regardless of how carefully Dom tried to shield him. The thought strengthened his resolve. The coming confrontation wasn't just about justice for betrayal. It was about creating the most stable future possible for Mason. With that purpose firmly in mind, Dom prepared for the decisive engagement to come. Chapter 7. Checkmate. The conference room at Walsh & Associates projected understated power through its minimalist design. A gleaming walnut table, ergonomic chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Dom arrived 20 minutes early, reviewing documents with his legal team while they awaited the other parties. Teresa Mendoza adjusted her silver-framed glasses, scanning the final settlement proposal. Remember, regardless of how heated the discussion becomes, our focus remains on Mason's welfare. Judge Alvarez has made it clear she will prioritize stability and establish care routines in any custody determination. Dom nodded, his calm exterior masking the emotional turbulence beneath. If they reject our terms, we're prepared to proceed with the full filing. Everything is ready, Greg Walsh confirmed. Court pleadings, supporting evidence, and the regulatory complaints, all prepared for immediate submission. The opposing party arrived as a unified front. Brooke, Nolan Pierce, Wallace and Louise Harrington, and their attorney, Sloan Davidson, a razor-thin woman with calculated movements and eyes that assessed every detail of the room upon entry. No introductions were exchanged as they took their seats opposite Dom's team. The atmosphere crackled with tension despite the room's careful climate control. Davidson opened. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss amicable resolution of this unfortunate situation. My clients are committed to finding arrangements that serve Mason's best interests while acknowledging the valid concerns of all parties. That's a welcome change from yesterday's unilateral custody demand. Mendoza responded evenly. Has your position evolved regarding primary physical custody? Davidson glanced briefly at Wallace Harrington before continuing. We believe a more balanced approach may be appropriate. Perhaps a joint physical custody arrangement with structured transitions between households. Dom remained silent, observing the dynamic among the opposing group. Brooke sat rigidly beside Pierce, whose hand occasionally brushed hers beneath the table in what was meant to be a reassuring gesture. Wallace dominated their side, physically, his broad shoulders and authoritative posture reflecting his accustomed role as decision-maker. Louise maintained a facade of concerned grandmother that didn't reach her calculating eyes. After half an hour of preliminary discussions that established little substantive progress, Dom finally spoke. Let's stop circling the actual issues, he said quietly, his voice nonetheless commanding immediate attention. You've had approximately 12 hours to consider my proposal. Either you accept my terms, or we proceed to litigation today. Davidson's professional smile tightened. Mr. Tanner, mediation requires good faith negotiation from both sides. Your position appears inflexible. There's a fundamental misconception at this table, Dom replied, his gaze sweeping across each opponent. You believe we're negotiating a divorce settlement. We're not. We're determining whether the dissolution of my marriage occurs privately with minimal collateral damage, or publicly with maximum exposure of all relevant facts. Wallace Harrington leaned forward, his patience visibly fraying. If you think you can threaten my family and business. This isn't a threat, Mr. Harrington. It's a simple statement of cause and effect. Your daughter and son-in-law conspired to remove my child from my life. You and your wife actively facilitated that conspiracy, including attempting to influence judicial proceedings. These actions have consequences. You can't prove any of that, Louise interjected, her manicured hand gripping her water glass with whitened knuckles. Dom turned to Greg Walsh, who activated the wall-mounted display screen. A document appeared showing financial transfers between Harrington-controlled entities and companies connected to Judge Watkins' campaign finance structure. This is one example of approximately 300 pages of documentation we've assembled, Dom explained conversationally. Financial records, text messages, email exchanges, voice recordings, travel itineraries, a comprehensive chronicle of your collective efforts. He focused his attention on Pierce, who had remained strategically silent throughout the discussion. Dr. Pierce, are you familiar with the American Academy of Pediatrics ethical guidelines regarding personal relationships with patients' family members? Pierce stiffened almost imperceptibly. Mason was never my direct patient, but you conducted what you characterized as informal consultations regarding his developmental progress, did you not? While maintaining a sexual relationship with his mother and planning to assume a parental role in his life. The Medical Ethics Board might find that distinction less compelling than you hope. Pierce glanced uncertainly at Davidson, who intervened smoothly. We're not here to discuss hypothetical ethical complaints. We're focused on Mason's future care arrangements. Mason's future is precisely what concerns me, Dom agreed. Particularly the plans to eventually transfer him to the Keller Residential Center in Vermont once he became an inconvenient addition to your new family unit. Brooke gasped audibly, while Louise murmured, "Dear God," under her breath. "Yes, I know about that too," Dom confirmed, his voice hardening for the first time. The preliminary assessment Dr. Keller prepared without ever meeting Mason. The discussions about transitional placement once international residence was established. The renovation plans for the Pierce home that included only temporary accommodations for my son. He paused, allowing the comprehensive extent of his knowledge to register fully. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, about this conspiracy that I haven't uncovered. Wallace Harrington, accustomed to controlling difficult situations through force of personality, attempted to regain the initiative. Whatever you think you know, dragging a child with special needs through contentious litigation won't benefit anyone, especially Mason. On that single point, we agree, Dom responded, which is why I've offered terms that would avoid public proceedings entirely. Davidson, recognizing the deteriorating position, attempted to establish a negotiating posture. Your proposal essentially gives you everything and leaves our clients with nearly nothing. Surely you can acknowledge that's not a reasonable starting point for discussion. Ms. Davidson, you misunderstand the fundamental dynamic here, Dom explained with almost clinical detachment. This is a negotiation between equal parties seeking compromise. This is an opportunity for your clients to mitigate the consequences of actions they've already taken. He turned to Brooke directly. You chose to maintain a 7-year affair while systematically detaching from your parental responsibilities. You chose to divert marital assets to support your paramour's household. You chose to conspire to separate me from my son. Those choices have already occurred. What remains is determining their cost. Brooke's composure finally cracked. You're talking like this is some kind of business transaction. This is our family. No, Brooke, this was our family. Until you decided to create a different one with Nolan, Dom corrected, his voice carrying a trace of the pain he typically concealed. Now we're simply resolving the aftermath of that decision. Looking directly at his wife, Dom allowed genuine emotion to color his words for the first time. I would have forgiven almost anything else. Financial indiscretions, personal betrayal, even the affair itself. We might have found a path forward from those. But you conspired to take my son. You planned to diminish and eventually sever my role in his life. That is unforgivable. The room fell silent as the finality of his position registered with everyone present. Greg Walsh used the moment to distribute copies of Dom's settlement proposal. My client's terms remain as previously stated. Full physical and legal custody of Mason, with standard visitation rights for Mrs. Tanner. Equal division of the marital estate, excluding Mr. Tanner's business interests and the approximately $380,000 already diverted to Dr. Pierce's household expenses. In exchange, all evidence regarding the affair, financial improprieties, and attempted custody manipulation remains confidential. And the regulatory investigations? Wallace demanded, will be rendered moot by anonymous corrections to the permit applications and voluntary compliance adjustments, Walsh explained. The reviews would naturally conclude without public findings or penalties. Davidson conferred briefly with her clients before responding. We need to discuss these terms privately. Of course, Mendoza agreed. We'll give you the room. But be aware that our timeline is constrained. If we don't have acceptance by noon, we'll proceed with court filings this afternoon. Dom and his legal team relocated to an adjacent office while the opposing parties deliberated. As they waited, Dom found himself unexpectedly calm. After months of clandestine preparation and strategic maneuvering, the matter was finally approaching resolution. They'll accept, Walsh predicted, checking his watch. The Harringtons have too much to lose in a public battle. Brooke will resist, Dom countered. This outcome doesn't align with her narrative of herself as the devoted mother, creating a better situation for her special needs child. Her parents will overrule her, Mendoza asserted confidently. Wallace Harrington didn't build his empire by indulging emotional reactions over pragmatic solutions. At 11:47 a.m., they were summoned back to the conference room. The atmosphere had visibly shifted. Wallace now dominated the opposing side completely, with Brooke appearing defeated and Pierce studiously avoiding eye contact with anyone. Davidson spoke with professional neutrality. After careful consideration, my clients are prepared to accept your proposed terms with 3 modifications. She outlined their counterproposal, an adjustment to the visitation schedule allowing Brooke more flexibility with holiday arrangements, a provision requiring consultation on major medical decisions regarding Mason, and a mutual non-disparagement clause protecting all parties' reputations. Dom considered these requests briefly before nodding. The visitation schedule can be adjusted as requested. Medical decisions remain solely my authority, but I will notify Mrs. Tanner of significant developments. The non-disparagement provision is acceptable. With those minor revisions, the settlement agreement was finalized. As the documents were prepared for signatures, an uncomfortable silence descended over the conference room. Brooke finally broke it, addressing Dom directly. You've won. Are you satisfied now? Dom met her gaze without animosity. This was never about winning Brooke. It was about protecting Mason from a conspiracy that would have damaged him irrevocably. I would never have hurt Mason, she insisted, though without her former conviction. Everything I did was to give him the best possible care. By separating him from the parent, who has been his primary caregiver, by disrupting his established routines and support network, by eventually transitioning him to a residential facility while you created a new family with Nolan. Dom shook his head slightly. Those actions would have hurt Mason profoundly, whether you're capable of recognizing that reality or not. Before Brooke could respond, Wallace interceded. Enough. The agreement is reached. There's nothing to be gained from further discussion. The signing process proceeded, each party affixing their signature to documents that formalized the dissolution of the Tanner marriage and established the framework for Mason's future care. As they concluded, Dom addressed the assembled group one final time. I want to be absolutely clear about something. While these documents resolve our legal obligations, my commitment to Mason's welfare remains absolute. Any future attempt to undermine his stability or my relationship with him will result in consequences far beyond what we've discussed today. His gaze rested briefly on each conspirator in turn. I've demonstrated my capacity to uncover deceptions and respond decisively. Remember that if temptation to interfere arises in the future. The message delivered, Dom gathered his materials and departed without further interaction, leaving behind people who had underestimated both his determination and his capacity to protect what he valued most. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Mendoza regarded Dom thoughtfully. They still don't fully understand what happened, do they? No, Dom agreed. They believe their plan failed because I discovered it in progress. They don't realize I've been aware of their intentions almost from inception and merely allowed them to proceed until I had assembled comprehensive countermeasures. Will Brooke adhere to the agreement? Dom considered the question carefully. Initially, yes. The Harringtons will ensure compliance to protect their business interests. Long term, that depends on whether today's experience fundamentally changes her perspective. And if it doesn't, then any future attempts at interference will meet even more definitive responses, Dom stated simply. Mason's welfare isn't negotiable. As he exited the building into the spring sunshine, Dom felt a weight lifting that he had carried for months. Not just the burden of managing his clandestine counter-strategy, but the deeper weight of a marriage that had been hollowed out from within long before he recognized its emptiness. His phone chimed with Mason's special ringtone. The school was calling, likely with a question about his therapy schedule. Dom answered immediately, his voice warming as he shifted from the calculating strategist who had dismantled a complex conspiracy to the devoted father who remained focused on his son's daily needs. The legal battle had reached its conclusion, but the more important work continued, providing Mason with the stable, supportive environment he needed to thrive. That mission would guide Dom's actions in the days and years ahead, long after the documents signed today were filed away in courthouse archives. Chapter 8. Ripples and Consequences. 3 months after the settlement, Dom stood in the kitchen preparing Mason's favorite pancake breakfast, carefully arranging blueberries in the precise pattern his son preferred. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as though Brooke's departure had removed a subtle contamination beyond just her physical presence. The initial transition had been challenging for Mason. Despite Brooke's diminishing engagement over recent years, her sudden absence from daily routines created disruption in his carefully structured world. Dom had worked closely with Mason's therapy team to establish new patterns and expectations, maintaining as much consistency as possible while acknowledging the fundamental change in their household. "Dad, today's pancake arrangement is geometrically perfect," Mason observed as he entered the kitchen, still in his sensory-friendly pajamas. "Did you use a protractor?" Dom smiled at his son's literal interpretation. "Just careful measurement by Ocean Boy. Did you sleep well?" "I achieved approximately 7.4 hours of sleep, according to my monitoring app," Mason reported seriously. "That's within the recommended range for neurological processing efficiency." The new monitoring app had been Mason's idea, a way to track his own sleep patterns and identify potential correlations with his sensory regulation the following day. Dom had encouraged the project as both a learning opportunity and a way for Mason to exercise greater agency in managing his autism. As they settled into breakfast, Dom reviewed the day's schedule. "Remember, you have occupational therapy after school today. Vanessa will pick you up and bring you home afterward. I have a meeting with the City Planning Commission, but I should be back by 6:30 for dinner." Mason nodded, cutting his pancakes into precisely sized pieces. "It's Mom's visitation weekend. Will she be picking me up from school tomorrow?" Dom kept his expression neutral despite the familiar tightening in his chest whenever Brooke's visitation arose. "That's the plan. Have you decided what you'd like to pack for the weekend?" "My weighted blanket, ocean sound machine, and the new book about cephalopods," Mason listed without hesitation. "And my emergency contact card." The emergency contact card had been Mason's idea as well, a laminated card containing Dom's phone number and address, which Mason kept in his pocket during visitations with Brooke. Though he never explicitly stated it, Dom recognized it as his son's self-developed safety measure, a connection to his secure base during potentially stressful transitions. Brooke had maintained her visitation schedule with surprising consistency since the divorce, though the quality of her engagement with Mason varied considerably. Sometimes she made genuine efforts to accommodate his needs. Other visits seemed performed more for appearance than connection, particularly when Harringtons were involved. After breakfast, Dom dropped Mason at school and headed to his office at Tannerbilt. The company had thrived in recent months, partly due to Dom's ability to refocus his full attention on operations now that the personal crisis had resolved. His assistant, Eliza, met him at the door with a tablet displaying his daily schedule. "The Planning Commission meeting is confirmed for 4:30. Also, Blake Reed called. He said it's not urgent, but asked that you contact him when convenient." Dom raised an eyebrow at the mention of the investigator. Though their formal professional relationship had concluded, Reed occasionally shared information he encountered that might be relevant to Dom's interests. In the privacy of his office, Dom returned the call. "Hope I'm not disturbing anything important," Reed began without preamble. "Just thought you should know about some developments with your former in-laws." "What kind of developments?" "The Harrington Market Street project is facing serious financial trouble. They've lost 2 major investors in the past month, and construction has stalled on the upper floors." Dom processed this information with mild interest, but no satisfaction. The Harringtons' business challenges were no longer his concern, provided they maintained their distance from his affairs with Mason. Any indication this might affect their compliance with our agreement? He asked, cutting to his primary concern. Nothing direct, Reed answered. But financial pressure sometimes motivates desperate measures. Thought you should be aware of the changing circumstances. I appreciate the heads up. Anything else I should know? Reed hesitated briefly. Your ex-wife and Pierce have been house hunting in the school district where you and Mason live. They've toured 3 properties within a 5-mile radius of your home in the past 2 weeks. This development was more concerning. The settlement agreement didn't restrict where Brooke could live, but the strategic implications of relocating closer to Mason's school and Dom's residence were troubling. Any contact between Pierce and Mason's school or therapy providers? Dom asked, mentally reviewing potential vulnerabilities. Nothing documented, but it might be worth refreshing your privacy protections with those entities. After ending the call, Dom sat contemplating this new information. The settlement agreement had resolved the immediate crisis, but the underlying motivations remained unchanged. Brooke, Pierce, and the Harringtons had accepted defeat tactically while potentially maintaining their strategic objectives. Dom scheduled a meeting with his legal team to review contingency measures, then focused on his immediate work priorities. The Planning Commission meeting that afternoon would determine approval for a major commercial development that could significantly expand Tanner-Built's portfolio. As he reviewed the presentation materials, Dom's phone chimed with a text from Vanessa, Mason's behavioral therapist. Unusual situation at therapy today. Brooke showed up unannounced during Mason's session. Said she wanted to observe his progress. I limited access per your instructions, but thought you should know. Dom responded immediately. Thank you for following protocol. Any apparent reason for the unexpected visit? She asked several questions about his current IEP and medical treatment plan. Seemed particularly interested in his upcoming neuropsychological evaluation. The evaluation Vanessa referenced was scheduled for the following month, an important assessment that would inform Mason's educational accommodations and therapy goals for the coming year. Its results would also document Mason's ongoing need for consistency and specialized support. Dom connected the dots immediately. If Brooke and Pierce were indeed planning some renewed attempt at custody modification, Mason's upcoming evaluation would provide either supporting evidence or a significant obstacle, depending on its findings. This realization transformed a routine planning commission meeting into an unwelcome distraction. Throughout the afternoon presentation, part of Dom's mind remained occupied with strategic calculations, assessing vulnerabilities and formulating countermeasures. By the time he arrived home that evening, Dom had developed a preliminary response plan. He found Mason and Vanessa in the specialized sensory room, working on a marine biology project that combined academic content with fine motor skill development. Dad, Mason exclaimed with unusual animation. We're creating a taxonomic classification system for cephalopods. Vanessa helped me design a database with multiple sorting parameters. Dom joined them on the floor, examining the meticulously organized information cards Mason had created. This is impressive work, Ocean Boy. You've included depth range as a classification factor. That's innovative thinking. After Mason went to bed, Dom and Vanessa discussed the day's concerning development. She seemed different, Vanessa observed, her professional demeanor momentarily revealing personal concern. More focused, more deliberate in her questions. In the past, her interest in Mason's therapy progress always seemed performative, checking boxes without genuine engagement. And today she took notes, asked about specific cognitive assessments and how his sensory processing has evolved over the past 6 months. It felt like preparation. Dom nodded grimly. Reed's information suggests they may be positioning for another attempt at custody modification, moving closer to our neighborhood, gathering updated information on Mason's care needs. These are preliminary steps toward establishing themselves as a viable alternative placement. But the settlement agreement. Establish current arrangements, not permanent ones. Custody determinations can always be revisited if a party can demonstrate significant change in circumstances. Vanessa's expression hardened. Mason has made tremendous progress in his current environment. His anxiety levels are down, his self-regulation strategies have improved, and his academic engagement has increased significantly. Disrupting that stability now would be detrimental to his development, which is precisely why we need to ensure his upcoming evaluation thoroughly documents that progress and its connection to his current living situation, Dom agreed. I'll contact Dr. Winters tomorrow to discuss ensuring the assessment protocol captures the full context of Mason's home environment. After Vanessa departed, Dom sat alone in his home office, reviewing the household security system that had become second nature during the months of clandestine monitoring. Though he had disabled most of the internal surveillance after Brooks' departure, maintaining only standard home security, he now considered whether additional measures might be prudent. The thought immediately troubled him. He had promised himself that the intense vigilance of the divorce period would not become a permanent state of mind, that he wouldn't allow the betrayal to transform him into someone perpetually anticipating threats. Yet the protection of Mason required pragmatic assessment of genuine risks, not just psychological healing from past injuries. Finding the balance between reasonable precaution and paranoid hypervigilance would be an ongoing challenge. Dom's phone chimed with a text from an unexpected source. Louise Harrington. Need to speak with you privately. Important regarding Mason's welfare. Please call when convenient. The message was surprising not just in its content, but its very existence. Since the settlement, the Harringtons had maintained rigid formality in any necessary communications, routing everything through attorneys rather than direct contact. Dom considered ignoring the message, but ultimately decided direct information was preferable to speculation. He placed the call, maintaining his guard against potential manipulation. Louise answered immediately. Thank you for calling back, Dominic. I realize this is unusual. What's this about, Louise? Her normally imperious tone was subdued. I'm concerned about Brooks' current state of mind and how it might affect Mason. Wallace wouldn't approve of this conversation, but as Mason's grandmother, I felt obligated to warn you. Dom remained silent, neither encouraging nor discouraging her disclosure. The Harrington Group is facing significant financial challenges, Louise continued, confirming Reed's intelligence. The Market Street project has encountered regulatory complications that Wallace believes are consequences of our previous conflict with you. If you're suggesting I've interfered with your business operations, you're mistaken, Dom stated flatly. I've adhered scrupulously to our agreement. I'm not accusing you, Louise clarified hastily. But Wallace sees conspiracies where none exist. The financial pressure has created tension between him and Brooke, particularly regarding her ongoing support. What does this have to do with Mason? Louise sighed audibly. Wallace has indicated he'll no longer subsidize Brooke's lifestyle unless she demonstrates more initiative in challenging the current custody arrangement. He believes Mason should be raised within the Harrington family sphere of influence, especially given the potential inheritance implications. The naked calculation regarding Mason's future as leverage for financial support confirmed Dom's worst assessments of the Harrington family values. Still, the information was valuable, if accurate. Why are you telling me this? Because I've seen Mason during his weekend visits, Louise replied, her voice softening slightly. He's thriving in your care. The progress he's made since the divorce is remarkable. I may not understand his condition fully, but I recognize a child who feels secure and supported. Dom remains skeptical of this apparent change of heart. And I don't want him used as a pawn in Wallace's financial maneuvering or Brooke's attempts to please her father. The custody arrangement is working. Disrupting it now would harm Mason simply to satisfy Wallace's pride and solve Brooke's financial dependence. What exactly is being planned? Brooke and Nolan are preparing to petition for modification of the custody order. They've consulted with a different attorney who specializes in special needs custody cases. The strategy involves arguing that their combined household, with Nolan's professional expertise and 2 children with similar conditions, provides superior developmental opportunities for Mason. The information aligned with Reed's intelligence and Vanessa's observations, suggesting its probable accuracy despite the questionable source. Again, why are you telling me this? Dom pressed. Because I'm tired, Dominic, Louise admitted with sudden candor. Tired of the machinations, the positioning, the treating of Mason as an asset to be acquired rather than a child to be nurtured. I've lost my only daughter to this obsession with challenging your custody, and I'm watching my husband risk our family's financial security over a battle that shouldn't be fought. Dom absorbed this information silently, assessing its strategic implications while reserving judgment on Louise's apparent change of perspective. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked. "Nothing. Consider this information a gesture of goodwill toward my grandson. Use it as you see fit to protect his stability." After ending the call, Dom spent hours reviewing his options. If Louise's information was accurate, the emerging threat required preemptive countermeasures rather than reactive defense. The approaching neuropsychological evaluation would be a critical piece of evidence in any custody modification proceeding, documenting either Mason's progress in his current environment or identifying areas where Pierce's professional expertise might arguably provide additional benefit. The following morning, Dom arranged a conference call with Dr. Eleanor Winters, Mason's developmental pediatrician, and Teresa Mendoza, his custody attorney. "I want to ensure the upcoming evaluation thoroughly documents not just Mason's current functioning, but the environmental factors that have supported his recent progress," Dom explained after sharing the intelligence he had gathered. Dr. Winters responded with professional concern. "The standard protocol already includes environmental assessments, but we can certainly expand that component. Mason's improvements over the past quarter have been significant. Reduced anxiety, improved social interaction, more effective self-regulation strategies. The connection between those gains and his stable home routine should be explicitly documented. Would it be advisable to include a home observation component?" Mendoza suggested. "Having the evaluator observe Mason in his primary environment would strengthen the documentation of how specifically adapted supports in your home contribute to his functioning." "That's an excellent suggestion," Dr. Winters agreed. "I'll coordinate with the neuropsychologist to include both home and school observations as part of the comprehensive assessment." As the weekend approached, Dom helped Mason prepare for his visitation with Brooke. Though he maintained a positive demeanor for his son's benefit, internally Dom concentrated on equipping Mason with tools to navigate potential questioning or manipulation. "Remember, Ocean Boy, if anyone asks you questions that make you uncomfortable, you can always say, 'I need to think about that,' or 'I'd like to talk to my dad first," Dom reminded gently as they packed Mason's overnight bag. "Like if Mom asks about my evaluation?" Mason asked with his characteristic directness. Dom concealed his surprise at Mason's perception. "Has Mom mentioned your upcoming evaluation?" "She asked if I was nervous about the big test coming up and said Dr. Pierce could help me prepare because he's an expert on how brains like mine work." The attempted manipulation was so transparent that Dom momentarily struggled to maintain his composed expression. "The evaluation isn't something you need to prepare for, remember? It's just different activities to show how your amazing brain processes information. There are no wrong answers." When Brooke arrived to collect Mason, Dom observed subtle changes in her presentation. Her typically immaculate appearance remained, but there was a new intensity to her interactions with Mason, an almost studied quality to her demonstrations of maternal attention. "We have such a fun weekend planned," she told Mason with bright enthusiasm. "We're going to visit a very special school with an amazing science program. And Olivia and Owen are excited about showing you their new coding project." Dom noted the strategic nature of these activities, highlighting educational opportunities not available in Mason's current school and encouraging connection with Pierce's children. The choreography was obvious to an informed observer. "Mason has occupational therapy on Monday morning," Dom reminded Brooke as they prepared to depart. "He'll need to be back Sunday evening to maintain his sleep routine." "Actually, I was hoping to keep him through Monday morning," Brooke countered. "Nolan has arranged for Mason to meet the director of the Cognitive Development Center. It's a wonderful opportunity. Any changes to the visitation schedule need to be arranged in advance," Dom responded firmly. Mason's therapy appointments take priority over introductory meetings, regardless of how prestigious the institution. Brooke's pleasant facade momentarily slipped, revealing frustration before she recovered her composed expression. Of course, Mason's routine is important. We'll have him back Sunday evening as scheduled. After they departed, Dom contacted Blake Reed, requesting surveillance during the weekend visitation. The measure felt extreme, but the coordinated efforts to position for custody modification warranted heightened vigilance. Reed's reports throughout the weekend confirmed Dom's concerns. Instead of the usual activities during Mason's visits, Brooke and Pierce had orchestrated a series of evaluative interactions. Visits to an exclusive private school specializing in twice exceptional children, meetings with educational consultants, and a tour of Pierce's research facility where he conducted studies on cognitive development in children with autism. Most concerning was a scheduled appointment with Dr. Martin Keller, the same psychologist who had previously prepared the preliminary assessment for the Vermont residential facility. Reed confirmed that Mason was taken to Keller's private practice office for what was presented to Mason as a friendly chat about his interests. By Sunday evening, when Brooke returned Mason home, Dom had assembled a comprehensive understanding of their strategy. They were creating alternative assessment data through specialists aligned with their interests, establishing connections with prestigious educational institutions that could arguably provide superior opportunities for Mason, and documenting interactions between Mason and Pierce's children to demonstrate potential developmental benefits of blended family dynamics. Mason appeared exhausted when he returned, his typical post-transition regulation strategies working overtime to manage the stimulation overload from the packed weekend agenda. There were too many new people, he confided as Dom helped him settle into his bedtime routine. Mom said they were all important for my future opportunities, but their offices had fluorescent lights that buzzed at 60 hertz. I counted 7 different locations with improper lighting specifications. Dom listened carefully, both to support Mason's processing of the overwhelming experiences and to gather information about the orchestrated evaluative circuit he had been subjected to. One doctor asked lots of questions about living here with you. Mason continued, arranging his comfort items in their precise positions for optimal sleep support. He wanted to know if I get lonely without other kids around, and if I wish I could live somewhere with more resources for special children. What did you tell him? Dom asked, maintaining a neutral tone despite his internal alarm at the leading questions posed to his 11-year-old son. I said I'm not lonely because I have you and my school friends and my online marine biology club, and that we have lots of resources here because you built everything exactly how my sensory profile needs it. Mason paused, looking up with sudden concern. Was that okay to say? Dom hugged him gently, careful to apply the precise pressure that Mason found comforting rather than overwhelming. That was perfectly okay. You told the truth, and that's always the right thing to do. After Mason fell asleep, Dom documented everything his son had shared about the weekend's activities, adding this information to the growing file of evidence regarding Brooke and Pierce's orchestrated campaign. The following morning, Dom contacted Mendoza to update her on these developments and schedule a strategy session. The proactive approach they had initiated with Mason's upcoming official evaluation would need to be expanded to address the shadow assessment process being conducted by Brooke's team. As he drove to work, Dom reflected on the fundamental irony of the situation. In their determination to position themselves as superior caregivers for Mason, Brooke and Pierce had subjected him to precisely the kind of disruptive, overwhelming experiences that demonstrated their fundamental lack of understanding of his needs. The contrast between their approach, parading Mason through a series of evaluative encounters with strangers in stimulating environments, and Dom's consistent focus on stability, routine, and gradual introduction of new experiences highlighted the essential difference in their philosophies of care. This observation crystallized Dom's strategic response. Rather than merely defending against their maneuvers, he would illuminate the profound disconnect between their claimed expertise and their actual treatment of Mason. The evidence wasn't just in documents and professional assessments, but in the lived experience of a child being used as a pawn in adult machinations. As he arrived at his office, Dom felt a calm certainty settle over him. The battle lines were clearly drawn, the opposing strategy transparent. Now he would implement countermeasures not just to protect his custody rights, but to definitively end the ongoing threat to Mason's stability. The ripples from Brooke's betrayal continue to spread, but Dom had learned to navigate turbulent waters. This renewed challenge would be met with the same determination that had secured Mason's well-being through the divorce process, a father's unwavering commitment to protecting his son, whatever the cost. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. The petition for custody modification arrived exactly as Dom had anticipated, filed strategically just days after Mason's official neuropsychological evaluation, but before the results were finalized. The timing was calculated to introduce their alternative assessments into consideration before the official evaluation could document Mason's progress in his current environment. Dom received the legal notice with outward calm, reviewing the filing with Teresa Mendoza in her office while Mason attended his regular afternoon therapy session. "They've assembled an impressive array of experts," Mendoza observed, paging through the supporting documentation. Dr. Keller's assessment, evaluations from the Cognitive Development Center, recommendations from the headmaster of Brighton Academy, all suggesting Mason would benefit from their proposed arrangement of joint physical custody transitioning to primary placement with Brooke and Pierce. "Quantity over quality," Dom responded. "None of these experts has an established relationship with Mason or understanding of his specific needs. They're offering generic assessments based on limited, choreographed interactions." Mendoza nodded. "That will be our primary counterargument. But they've constructed a compelling narrative for a judge unfamiliar with autism spectrum disorders. The combined household with two parents, including a neurological specialist, plus siblings with similar conditions creating a therapeutic family environment. The petition outlined Brooke and Pierce's proposed arrangement. Initially equal physical custody, transitioning over 6 months to primary placement with them, with Dom having weekend visitation rights. The justification centered on the extraordinary developmental opportunities available through Pierce's professional connections and the peer socialization benefits of living with the twins. What the document conspicuously omitted was any reference to their previous plan to eventually transfer Mason to the Vermont residential facility, a strategy they had apparently abandoned after recognizing Dom's awareness of those intentions. "They've requested an expedited hearing," Mendoza noted, claiming Mason's educational needs require prompt resolution before the next school year. "Of course they have," Dom replied. "They want to circumvent the completion of his official evaluation and prevent us from assembling counter-evidence. Judge Alvarez is still assigned to the case, which works in our favor. She's familiar with the history and previously expressed concerns about their attempts to influence judicial proceedings." Dom considered their position carefully. "We could oppose the expedited timeline, but that creates the impression we're attempting to delay. I prefer to meet their challenge directly and decisively." "That's risky," Mendoza cautioned. "We'd have limited time to prepare our response." "We've been preparing our response since we first detected their renewed interest 3 months ago," Dom pointed out. "I'd rather control the confrontation than allow them to dictate the terms of engagement." After discussing strategy options, they agreed to accept the expedited hearing while filing counter-motions that would structure the proceedings to their advantage. Mendoza would request that Mason's treatment team be allowed to testify regarding his progress and stability in the current arrangement before any new evaluations were considered. As Dom left the meeting, he received a text from Blake Reed. Financial records show $250,000 transfer from Harrington personal accounts to Pierce yesterday. Timing suggests connection to filing. The information confirmed Wallace Harrington's continued financial backing of the custody challenge, consistent with Louise's warning about her husband's pressure on Brooke to pursue the case. Over the next 2 weeks, Dom balanced careful preparation for the hearing with maintaining Mason's routine and stability. He was determined that his son would experience minimal disruption from the legal proceedings, regardless of the pressure tactics employed by the opposing side. When Dr. Winters delivered the completed neuropsychological evaluation, the results strongly supported Dom's position. Mason showed significant improvements in emotional regulation, academic engagement, and adaptive functioning, all explicitly linked to the consistency and specifically adapted support systems in his home environment with Dom. The report included a section addressing potential disruption risks. Given Mason's history and neurological profile, significant changes to his primary caregiving arrangement would pose substantial risks to his developmental trajectory and emotional well-being. The remarkable progress documented in this evaluation is directly attributable to the stability, consistency, and specifically tailored accommodations in his current living situation. Dr. Winters personally reviewed the findings with Dom. This is one of the strongest evaluation reports I've seen in terms of environmental impact documentation. The home observation component was particularly revealing. The specialized adaptations you've created for Mason are extraordinary, and his comfort and competence within that environment is unmistakable. Will it be enough to counter their expert opinions? Dom asked pragmatically. Their experts observed Mason in artificial settings during what was essentially a performative weekend. Dr. Winters replied with professional frankness. Our evaluation encompasses multiple environments over extended periods, with standardized measures and direct observational data. From a scientific perspective, there's no comparison in the validity of the assessments. As the hearing date approached, Brooke escalated her campaign. She requested additional visitation time to maintain Mason's connection with his mother during this stressful period, a transparent attempt to create evidence of increased maternal involvement before the court proceedings. More concerning were the coordinated efforts to influence Mason's perception. During his regular weekend visit, Brooke and Pierce showed him detailed plans for a bedroom in their new house, located just 10 minutes from his current school, complete with a built-in aquarium wall mimicking the one Dom had created in their home. Mason reported these developments to Dom with his characteristic directness. Mom says we could be a real family with Olivia and Owen if I lived with them most of the time. Dr. Pierce says he could help my brain reach its full potential because he's an expert on brains like mine. Dom maintained his composure, neither criticizing Brooke nor responding defensively. What do you think about that idea, Ocean Boy? Mason considered the question with his typical thoroughness. Their house plans look nice on paper. The aquarium wall is 8% larger than ours, but they haven't built it yet, so it's theoretical rather than actual. That's true, Dom acknowledged. Anything else you're thinking about it? I asked if my weighted blanket and sound machine would work the same in their house. Mom said I probably wouldn't need those things anymore because Dr. Pierce has more advanced regulation techniques. But my occupational therapist says my sensory tools are important for my neurological system. The attempted undermining of Mason's established therapeutic supports confirmed the fundamental problem with Brooke and Pierce's approach. Their focus on appearing to provide superior care rather than actually responding to Mason's specific needs. What would you prefer, Mason? Dom asked carefully. If you could decide your own living arrangements? Mason's response was immediate and unequivocal. I want to stay here with you. My systems work here. My brain knows the patterns. When things change too much, I have to use all my energy on adapting instead of learning and growing. Dom documented this conversation, adding it to the materials being prepared for the hearing. Mason's clearly expressed preference would carry significant weight with Judge Alvarez, particularly given his age and demonstrated capacity for thoughtful self-assessment. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Dom received an unexpected call from Louise Harrington. Her voice carried uncharacteristic urgency. They're planning to create a scene at the hearing, she warned without preamble. Wallace has arranged for several families from Pierce's practice to attend as character witnesses, prepared to testify about his extraordinary care for their children. Brooke has been coached to become emotional about being separated from her special needs child. Why are you continuing to provide this information? Dom asked directly. Louise was silent for a moment before responding. Because this has gone too far. Wallace and Brooke have convinced themselves that this is about Mason's welfare, but it's really about control and appearances. I've watched how Mason behaves during his visits, now compared to before the divorce. He's calmer, more engaged, more confident, clearly thriving in your care. This legal battle isn't serving his interests, it's damaging them. Have you expressed these concerns to your husband and daughter? I've tried. Wallace dismisses them as sentimental nonsense. Brooke listens but then consults with Pierce, who assures her that temporary disruption is justified by the superior developmental environment they can provide. The conversation confirmed Dom's assessment of the opposition strategy while providing valuable tactical information about their planned courtroom approach. On the morning of the hearing, Dom met with his legal team for final preparations. In addition to Mendoza, he had retained Dr. Eleanor Winters to testify as an expert witness regarding Mason's developmental needs and progress. Mason's regular therapist had provided affidavits documenting his stability and advancement in the current custody arrangement. Remember, emotional displays work against us, Mendoza advised as they reviewed their approach. No matter what accusations or characterizations they present, maintain composed, fact-based responses. Let them be the ones displaying theatrics while we demonstrate reliable, consistent caregiving. The courtroom was more crowded than anticipated when they arrived. As Louise had warned, several families were present, presumably patients of Pierce's practice positioned as character witnesses. Wallace and Louise Harrington sat directly behind Brooke and Pierce, with Wallace maintaining his typical authoritative posture while Louise appeared noticeably uncomfortable. Judge Alvarez entered and called the proceedings to order with efficient professionalism. This is a hearing on petition for modification of custody arrangements established in Tanner v. Tanner. Let me be clear from the outset. This court's primary concern is the welfare of the minor child, Mason Tanner. Arguments will focus exclusively on that consideration. Sloan Davidson presented the petitioner's case first, outlining what she characterized as extraordinary changes in circumstances justifying custody modification. Her presentation emphasized Pierce's professional credentials, the newly purchased home with specialized accommodations for children with autism, and the supposed developmental benefits of Mason living with peers who shared his diagnosis. Dr. Pierce is a nationally recognized expert in developmental neurology with specific expertise in autism spectrum disorders, Davidson argued, gesturing toward Pierce, who had adopted a thoughtful, professional demeanor. His twins, Olivia and Owen, have made remarkable progress under his care using innovative therapeutic approaches that could similarly benefit Mason. The parade of witnesses proceeded as Louise had warned. 3 sets of parents testified about Pierce's extraordinary care of their children, each account more effusive than the last. Educational consultants presented glossy materials about the exclusive private school where Mason would be enrolled. The headmaster of Brighton Academy described their groundbreaking program for twice exceptional children. Throughout these presentations, Dom maintained the calm, attentive posture Mendoza had advised, taking occasional notes while betraying no emotional reaction to the orchestrated testimonials. When Brooke took the stand, she performed her role with well-rehearsed emotion, describing her heartbreak at being separated from her son and her determination to create the perfect therapeutic environment for him. Mason needs the specialized guidance that only Nolan can provide, she testified, her voice breaking on cue. As his mother, it's agonizing to know there are resources and approaches that could help my special boy that he isn't receiving in his current situation. Judge Alvarez observed these performances with an increasingly skeptical expression, occasionally glancing at Dom as if gauging his reaction to these characterizations. When Davidson concluded the petitioner's presentation, she dramatically gestured toward the assembled experts and character witnesses. Your Honor, we have demonstrated not just a change in circumstances, but an extraordinary opportunity for Mason Tanner to receive world-class therapeutic support in a family environment specifically designed around his needs. We ask the court to recognize this unique situation and modify the custody arrangement accordingly. Judge Alvarez turned to Mendoza. Counsel for the respondent, you may present your case. Mendoza approached the podium with calm purpose. Your Honor, the petitioners have presented an impressive collection of theoretical benefits and professional credentials. What they haven't presented is any evidence of actual deficiency in Mason's current living situation or any demonstration that the proposed changes would better serve his specific needs. She activated a display screen visible to the court. Rather than gathering a crowd of unrelated character witnesses, we've brought Mason's actual treatment team, the professionals who have worked with him consistently throughout his development. The screen displayed a timeline of Mason's developmental milestones, therapy progress, and educational achievements over the past year, with particular emphasis on his advancements since the divorce. Dr. Eleanor Winters, Mason's developmental pediatrician for the past 7 years, will now testify regarding Mason's current status and the potential impact of the proposed custody modification. Dr. Winters took the stand with professional composure, presenting the comprehensive evaluation results. Her testimony systematically dismantled the petitioner's claims, contrasting their theoretical benefits with documented evidence of Mason's actual progress. In my professional opinion, Dr. Winters concluded, the stability, consistency, and specifically tailored accommodations in Mason's current living environment with his father are directly responsible for his remarkable developmental progress. Disrupting this arrangement would create significant risks to his continued advancement and emotional well-being. During cross-examination, Davidson attempted to challenge Dr. Winters' objectivity. Isn't it true that you've had a long-standing professional relationship with Mr. Tanner that might influence your assessment? I've had a professional relationship with both parents throughout Mason's development, Dr. Winters replied evenly. The difference is that one parent has maintained consistent involvement in Mason's treatment plan, while the other's engagement has become increasingly sporadic. Davidson pivoted quickly. But wouldn't you agree that Dr. Pierce's specialized expertise in neurodevelopmental disorders represents a significant resource that could benefit Mason? Theoretical expertise that isn't applied in ways that respect a child's individual needs and established support systems isn't beneficial, Dr. Winters responded. The evaluation data clearly shows that Mason's needs are being exceptionally well met in his current environment. As Davidson struggled to undermine Dr. Winters' testimony, Mendoza introduced a series of video recordings documenting Mason's daily routines in Dom's home. The carefully structured environment, the specialized accommodations, and most compellingly, Mason's visible comfort and confidence within that space. The contrast between these authentic glimpses of Mason's life and the choreographed testimonials presented by the petitioners was striking. Judge Alvarez watched the recordings with particular attention, noting the detailed adaptations Dom had implemented to support his son's needs. When the videos concluded, Mendoza played one final recording, a carefully conducted interview with Mason himself, performed by a court-appointed child advocate, in which he clearly expressed his preference to remain in his current home with his father. I don't want to move to Mom and Dr. Pierce's house, Mason stated with characteristic directness in the recording. Dad understands my systems. When I visit Mom, there are always new people and too many changes. It makes my brain too loud to function optimally. As the recording ended, Mendoza turned to her final strategy. Your Honor, we've presented comprehensive evidence of Mason's current well-being and the risks posed by the proposed custody modification. Now I'd like to address the petitioner's motivations and credibility in bringing this action. Davidson immediately objected. Your Honor, the petitioner's motivations are irrelevant. The only consideration should be Mason's best interests. I agree that Mason's interests are paramount, Judge Alvarez responded. However, the credibility of the parties seeking modification is certainly relevant to assessing their claims. Objection overruled. Mendoza activated the display screen again, this time showing financial records documenting the transfer of funds from Wallace Harrington to Pierce the day before filing the petition. These financial transfers suggest that this action is not driven solely by concern for Mason's welfare, but by external pressures and incentives. Mendoza explained. Furthermore, we have evidence that the petitioners have misrepresented their long-term intentions regarding Mason's care. The screen displayed communications between Brooke, Pierce, and the Vermont residential facility, dated before the divorce but continuing intermittently afterward. These records indicate that before and even after the divorce settlement, the petitioners were exploring residential placement options for Mason, directly contradicting their current claims about wanting to integrate him into their family unit. Gasps emerged from several observers in the courtroom. Brooke paled visibly, while Pierce stiffened in his chair. Wallace Harrington's face darkened with suppressed fury as he glanced accusingly at his wife, correctly identifying the source of this damaging information. Judge Alvarez studied the documents with focused attention before turning to Davidson. Counsel, would your clients care to address these communications regarding residential placement? Davidson conferred hurriedly with Brooke and Pierce before responding. Your Honor, these were merely exploratory inquiries about potential resources. Many parents of special needs, children research all available options, including options that would remove the child from both parents' homes shortly after gaining custody. Judge Alvarez asked pointedly. Before Davidson could formulate a response, Mendoza introduced her final evidence, a comprehensive proposal for Mason's continued care under the existing custody arrangement, including educational plans, therapy coordination, and mechanisms for appropriate information sharing with Brooke. Mr. Tanner remains committed to supporting Mason's relationship with his mother while maintaining the stability that has fostered his recent progress, Mendoza explained. This care plan demonstrates that commitment while prioritizing Mason's demonstrated needs over theoretical benefits or adult conveniences. As the hearing concluded, Judge Alvarez announced she would review all evidence before issuing her ruling. I'll provide my decision by the end of the week. Until then, the existing custody arrangement remains in effect. 3 days later, Dom received the court's decision. The petition for custody modification was denied in its entirety, with Judge Alvarez citing the overwhelming evidence of the child's progress and stability in his current environment, and expressing concern about the petitioner's questionable motivations and credibility regarding their long-term intentions. More significantly, the ruling included additional provisions. Any future petitions for custody modification would require demonstration of substantial change in circumstances specifically related to Mason's welfare, and all visitations would be conducted according to a court-approved schedule with detailed transition protocols to maintain Mason's stability. The ruling effectively ended Brooke and Pierce's campaign to gain custody while establishing robust protections against future attempts. For Dom, the court's decision brought vindication, but not satisfaction. The repeated attempts to separate him from his son had revealed the depths of betrayal he had experienced and the ongoing vulnerability created by Brooke's connection to Mason. As long as the Harringtons maintained their resources and influence, the threat of future interference remained. A permanent solution required addressing the root of the problem, not just winning individual battles, but eliminating the capacity of his adversaries to wage continued warfare. Epilogue: Calculated consequences. 1 month after the court ruling, Dom met with Greg Walsh and Blake Reed in a private dining room at an exclusive restaurant outside the city. The setting provided both privacy and a neutral territory for the discussion. The regulatory investigations into Harrington developments have uncovered more significant issues than initially anticipated, Walsh reported, sliding a folder across the table. What began as technical compliance reviews has revealed systematic patterns of corner cutting, especially regarding safety systems in their residential high-rises. Dom reviewed the documents thoughtfully. None of this was part of our original investigation. How did it surface? Once the initial reviews began, whistleblowers within their organization started coming forward, Reed explained. Former employees who had been silenced through NDAs and termination threats saw an opportunity to safely report concerns they'd harbored for years. What's the potential impact? Dom asked, focusing on the practical implications. Substantial, Walsh confirmed. They're facing stop work orders on 3 major projects, regulatory penalties that could reach 8 figures, and potential class action liability from residents of completed buildings that may require retrofitting. Dom considered this information carefully. The Harringtons faced a financial crisis entirely of their own making, one that had emerged from legitimate regulatory oversight rather than any orchestrated revenge campaign. What about Pierce's professional position? Dom inquired, turning to the second part of his information gathering. Reed opened his laptop, displaying a confidential hospital committee report. The ethics inquiry you mentioned during the hearing attracted attention. The medical center where Pierce conducts his research has opened a formal investigation into potential conflicts of interest and boundary violations. On what specific grounds? His involvement with a family member of a patient referred to his practice, undisclosed financial arrangements related to that relationship, and potential misuse of his position to influence custody proceedings. Reed scrolled through additional documents. They're particularly concerned about the residential facility connections, given that he refers patients there while receiving substantial speaking fees from the institution. The developments represented potential professional consequences for Pierce that had emerged naturally from his own ethical violations rather than any direct action by Dom. And Brooke? Dom asked, completing his assessment of the situation. Financially dependent on both Pierce and her parents, Reed confirmed. The trust fund income she received following the divorce settlement has been largely depleted through their legal expenses and the purchase of a new home. With the Harringtons facing financial constraints and Pierce's professional income potentially at risk, her position is increasingly precarious. Dom nodded, absorbing this information with measured contemplation. The consequences he had initially envisioned imposing through direct action were unfolding organically through the natural results of his adversary's own choices and behaviors. "What's our next move?" Walsh asked, clearly expecting Dom to leverage these developments. "Nothing," Dom replied simply. Both men looked at him with surprise. "Nothing," Reed echoed skeptically. "We monitor but don't intervene," Dom clarified. "The situation is resolving itself without requiring further action on our part. Any direct involvement now would only create perception of targeting rather than natural consequences." Walsh studied Dom with newfound respect. "You're playing a longer game than I realized." "I'm not playing any game at all," Dom corrected. "I've secured Mason's stability and implemented protections against future interference. That was my only objective. What happens to the Harringtons and Pierce now is the natural outcome of their own actions, not any revenge strategy." As Dom drove home that evening, he reflected on the transformation of his perspective over the past year. The cold rage that had fueled his initial counter-strategy had evolved into something more nuanced, a clear-eyed recognition that true justice emerged not from inflicting pain, but from allowing natural consequences to unfold. By summer's end, the full impact of those consequences had become apparent. The Harrington Group faced bankruptcy proceedings after major investors withdrew support following the regulatory investigations. Their flagship downtown development stood half-completed, a visible monument to compromised business practices. Pierce's medical center concluded its ethics investigation, resulting in his removal from research positions and clinical privileges restrictions that effectively ended his practice. The professional reputation he had leveraged in the custody battle collapsed under scrutiny of his ethical violations. Brooke, without family financial support or Pierce's income, was forced to sell the elaborate home they had purchased near Mason School. The perfect therapeutic environment they had promised in court proceedings never materialized beyond architectural plans. Most significantly, Wallace Harrington suffered a severe stroke attributed to stress from the financial crisis, leaving him partially paralyzed and dependent on the very healthcare system he had previously navigated through influence rather than standard channels. Dom learned of these developments through news reports and community gossip rather than active monitoring. His focus remained exclusively on Mason's well-being and their shared future. 1 year after the failed custody modification attempt, Dom picked up Mason from a scheduled visitation with Brooke, who now lived in a modest apartment across town. When Mason settled into the car, he seemed thoughtful rather than displaying his typical post-transition anxiety. "Mom seems different," he observed as they drove home. "She asked more questions about my marine biology research instead of talking about Dr. Pierce or Olivia and Owen." "Sometimes difficult experiences change people's perspectives," Dom replied carefully. "She said she's sorry for trying to make me move away from you," Mason continued. "She admitted it wasn't really about what was best for me." Dom maintained neutral expression despite his surprise at this apparent change in Brooke's attitude. "How did that make you feel?" Confused at first, but then relieved, Mason answered with his characteristic directness. "It's better when adults tell the truth." even if the truth isn't perfect. As they arrived home, Mason turned to his father with unexpected insight. "Dad, did you make all the bad things happen to Mom and her parents and Dr. Pierce?" The question caught Dom off guard with its perceptiveness. He considered his response carefully, recognizing the importance of honest communication with his increasingly perceptive son. "No, Mason, I protected you when they tried to take you away, but the difficulties they're experiencing now are the natural results of their own choices." Mason nodded, processing this distinction with his logical mind. Like how the coral reef dies when people make bad environmental choices, not because someone is punishing them, but because actions have natural consequences. "That's a very insightful comparison," Dom acknowledged, impressed by his son's developing understanding of cause and effect relationships. As Mason headed to his room to document his weekend observations in his journal, a self-regulation strategy developed with his therapist, Dom reflected on their conversation. The path from betrayal to the current reality had not followed the vengeful script he had initially imagined in his darkest moments of anger. Instead, it had unfolded through a series of natural consequences triggered by his simple determination to protect what mattered most. The Harringtons' business empire had collapsed not through targeted destruction, but through regulatory processes revealing their own compromised practices. Pierce's professional standing had disintegrated through ethical investigations into his own boundary violations. Brooks' materialistic lifestyle had evaporated as its supporting structures crumbled. None of these outcomes had required Dom's direct intervention beyond his initial self-protective measures. The most devastating consequences had emerged organically from the character and choices of those who had conspired against him. 2 years after discovering Brooks' betrayal at the airport, Dom sat on the deck of their home, now legally his alone, watching Mason meticulously cataloging specimens collected during their weekend diving trip. The traumatic events that had threatened to destroy their lives had instead refined them, strengthening their bond while revealing the impermanence of facades built on deception. Mason looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, I've been analyzing our family situation using comparative sociological frameworks." Dom smiled at his son's characteristic approach to emotional processing. "What have you concluded?" "That systems based on genuine connection and mutual support demonstrate superior resilience compared to systems built on appearance and control," Mason stated. "Our family unit, while numerically smaller, demonstrates greater structural integrity than the alternative configuration that was proposed." Dom recognized the profound truth within Mason's analytical framing. The empire the Harringtons had built through manipulation and appearances had collapsed when subjected to legitimate scrutiny. The professional authority Pierce had wielded had disintegrated when his ethical compromises were exposed. The family unit Brooke had attempted to construct with calculated performances rather than authentic care had never materialized beyond theoretical plans. In contrast, the simple, genuine connection between father and son had withstood every attempt to sever it, emerging stronger through each challenge. "That's an excellent analysis, Ocean Boy," Dom acknowledged. "Systems built on truth tend to last, while those built on deception eventually fail under their own weight." As evening approached, Dom prepared Mason's favorite dinner, a ritual unchanged since the turbulent days of discovery and conflict. The house felt different now, cleaner, more authentic, no longer contaminated by hidden deceptions. The journey from betrayal to this moment of peaceful evening routine had not followed the path of calculated revenge Dom had initially envisioned. Instead, it had unfolded through his unwavering commitment to protecting his son, coupled with his adversary's inability to escape the natural consequences of their own actions. The silent reckoning he had orchestrated had not required him to actively destroy those who had betrayed him. It had simply required him to stand firm in defense of what mattered most while allowing natural justice to take its course. As Mason carefully arranged his marine specimens in their precise taxonomic order, Dom reflected that true revenge wasn't found in actively destroying one's enemies, but in rebuilding one's own life with such integrity that the contrast alone became the most devastating consequence. The empire built on appearances had fallen. The family constructed through manipulation had dissolved. The professional standing achieved through ethical compromises had collapsed. And through it all, father and son remained. Their bond stronger, their future secure, their quiet evening routine a testament to the enduring power of authentic connection over elaborate deception. The revenge Dom had originally sought had ultimately manifested not through his orchestrated destruction of his betrayers, but through their inability to sustain the elaborate fabrications they had constructed. In the end, the most devastating consequence he could have inflicted was precisely what had naturally occurred. They had lost everything, while he had protected what truly mattered. As Mason began explaining the intricate biological adaptations of his latest specimen, Dom recognized the simple truth at the heart of their journey. Real power wasn't found in destroying others, but in building something so genuine that it withstood every attempt at destruction. And in that realization, the final piece of true resolution settled over the home they had defended and preserved together. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.